As a PhD candidate in English literature, I understood note-taking to be an essential part of my work. I read from hundreds of books a year, not just to keep up with recent publications in academic fields, but also to learn as much as I could about the development of English literature as a generalist. Even now that I've graduated and continue to teach, note-taking is still a huge part of my reading process. So in this video, I'm going to show you the method that I developed when studying for my generals and fields oral exams at Harvard. This is a method for taking and organizing your reading notes into your own personal encyclopedia. Not necessarily a commonplace book. It's something more than just a commonplace book. It's a reference system that works for any subject in the humanities. So whether you're studying English literature, history, philosophy, or theology, I think it's a method that would work for any self-learner. And most importantly, I think it's going to help you become a better reader. One who doesn't just read and forget, but one who reads and remembers. And if you study literature, you need familiarity with both the original works of literature, like the novels, the poems, the plays, and their place within literary history. And that's what this method is going to help you to do. Again, I don't use a commonplace book, and I don't use note cards anymore. I know some people love these methods, but for an academic who needs quick reference, it's just not sustainable. It's too difficult retrieving specific notes in a giant stack of journals or a pack of cards. So instead, I wrote my own personal encyclopedia with 3 parts. The encyclopedia contains first a timeline, entries organized by authors, and entries organized by topic. And all of this begins with annotating while reading. So before I show you the whole encyclopedia, let's first talk about reading. The first rule is to read without putting the book down. What Samuel Johnson said about reading footnotes goes for writing notes. He said when you're reading and the imagination is in flight, don't stoop to read a footnote. Go back to the footnote afterward. Let the imagination continue to soar unimpeded. So read for as long as you can without stopping. This will strengthen your attention and loosen your dependency upon distraction. But when you read with a pencil in hand for underlining. Do not stop to copy out passages yet. We'll do that at the end. The second rule is to annotate as you go. You'll be underlining 3 distinct types of passages. Dates are one of them. When I'm reading a work of literature or a book about English literary history, anytime I come to a date, I box it and I underline the important event. Second type of annotation I do is interesting quotations. If anything strikes me as interesting, I'll underline it, copy it out later. And third, interesting facts about the author. And we'll organize this information into the encyclopedic system after you finish reading. Remember, the goal is to read without putting down the book for as long as possible, and I always find it useful to make your own index at the back of the book on the blank flap. This is a trick that I learned from Ralph Waldo Emerson's reading. Whenever you come across something interesting in a book that touches upon one of your interests, record it in the back flap with the topic and the page number. That way, when you pull down the book from the shelf years later, you can consult what was interesting to you and find easy access to it that way. Now, once you've finished the book, it's time to record the passages into your reference system. Waiting till the end of the book will remind you of the argumentative or narrative arc of the book. So you'll have to go back and flip through pages and copy out what you've underlined and organize it that way. So let's now talk about logging that information. We're going to begin with the dates, and this is where we come to the timeline aspect of the encyclopedia. Let me show you what mine look like. I have an encyclopedia file in a Google Drive, double columned. Let's go to the 17th century. I have all of these dates logged in between 1600 and 1699. So after I've completed the book, I log in those dates that I boxed in with my pencil and I start logging them in. This is the method I started in 2020 when I realized that I didn't know enough about the 17th century. So I read biographies of the major poets, logged my notes in after each reading, and then I made a file for every century, as you saw there. I began actually, and you can do this too, by copying out the timelines at the back of the Oxford Histories of English Literature as a skeletal structure. And then when you go back and you're reading the biographies or the history books or the works of literature themselves, you can log it into this bare bones timeline that I copied from the Oxford Histories. It's so interesting to see what different poets and theologians and writers were up to. Let's go to, so you can get a sense, this is a 43-page document. Let's go to 1629 and see what was going on then. So here's the heading 1629. We see what was published by poetry here. Milton's Nativity was written, yet not published. Prose publications here by Bacon and Lancelot Andrews. Okay, so these are the publications, and you can find most of this in the Oxford Histories timeline. But what's really interesting, I added a theology section here. Arthur Hildersham, with his lectures on John, and Thomas Hooker, published anonymously his works. But you also then go to the persons, and this is where I added to the Oxford History timeline. So I was reading several biographies, John Milton, George Herbert, and with the dates, this is what we find. So you go to any date, and you can find what these poets were up to. Look here, this was the day, this was the year and the month, in which John Milton purchased a copy of Giovanni del Casa's Sonnets in London. And this was a pivotal moment because John Milton would resurrect the sonnet form after 40 or 50 years of neglect, and he would do something new with them. And that was something that he contributed to English literature that was very unique to his legacy. In the same year, we have George Herbert marrying Jane Danvers. And if you'll look over at the next year in 1630, this is actually the year when Herbert was made rector of Bemerton, where he wrote most of his poems in the Temple. But let's go to the year before Herbert was made rector of Bemerton. Go back to 1629. We'll see Thomas Adams organizing his sermons into a massive folio for the first time. And Thomas Adams was a preacher who was admired by the Romantics in the 19th century. Robert Southey called him the Shakespeare of the Puritans. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was reading him. Charles Lamb was also reading many of the 17th century divines. So it's an interesting connection there. Isaac Ambrose was serving in Yorkshire, and we have John Donne preaching several sermons at St. Paul's. This method reveals how the lives of John Milton, William Shakespeare overlapped for 7 years. You actually see some surprising connections. I don't know why, but I tend to think of Shakespeare and John Milton as being in two separate categories, existing on maybe different timelines, but that's just not true. Their lives overlapped. And that's what this method reveals. Other things that are interesting. If you move ahead to the 19th century, you'll be able to see how figures who are often discussed separately were actually publishing at the same time. So if you go to 1813, I'm going to zoom this in here, you'll find that this is the same year that Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice was published. And it's also the same year that Byron published The Giaour and Shelley published his Queen Mab, and the same year that the Romantic poet Robert Southey became poet laureate. Some people often think of Austen as belonging primarily to the 18th century, but she was publishing during the height of Romanticism, and this is, I think, very interesting and something that you'll discover when you start compiling these dates. What's great about this is that it helps you think of history, and whatever history you're studying, as a continuous flow instead of thematic blocks. We often have the idea of, for example, the American Renaissance as being something totally separate from modernism. But did you know that the lives of Emily Dickinson and Ezra Pound overlap? For 1 year, they overlap. Or did you know that Walt Whitman and T.S. Eliot were alive at the same time? Or that W.B. Yeats was 16 years old when Ralph Waldo Emerson died? Or did you know that Yeats was alive for most of Eliot's poetry career? That perhaps is not so surprising. But you can really get a sense of how literary movements are not tidy little boxes. Literary history is a river of dialogue, a fluid movement of influence and creativity. And that's what the timeline will show you. So that was the timeline. Now let's look at the other part of the encyclopedia, the topics. The Encyclopedia of Topics, where I have quotations from authors and poets or maps of their works in whatever book I'm reading. I often start my own index at the back, and this is where I log the interesting topics. And I often read with special interests, so each time a book mentions that special interest, I write that interest in the back with the page number. This is where the index is going to be helpful. Sometimes this can be a bit chaotic, but it's best to keep it neater than I do. Once I complete the book, I type out the underlined passages into this topical encyclopedia. I started logging a list of attributions that I was from books that I use and consulted quite a bit when I first started this. I dropped off the abbreviations at some point. I stopped doing this and just kept the attributions at the end of the quotations, as I'll show you. But you might want to use this for shorthand abbreviations. Let's start with A. So I've got it alphabetized. And we begin with Addison, Joseph Addison. I love what Samuel Johnson says about Addison in his essay on Joseph Addison. He says his purpose was to infuse literary curiosity by gentle and unsuspected conveyance into the gay, the idle, and the wealthy. He therefore presented knowledge in the most alluring form, not lofty and austere, but accessible and familiar. I think what Johnson says about Addison contains good words for any teacher or instructor. So I have Johnson's quotations about Addison logged under Addison, not Johnson. That way I can find out what other people are writing about Addison too. And for the first 2 volumes of The Spectator, when I was reading that several years ago, I actually cataloged them by topic. Every time he mentions allegory, those are numbers, essays number 3, 63, and 83. On clubs, essays 9, 30, and 32. This I thought would help me. I don't really consult it as often as I thought I would. Every time he mentions wit, he has several great essays on wit. There it is, logged twice, which that kind of needs to be deleted since it's included. False wit, essay 58. So you can see how this is actually really, really helpful for somebody who is reading. This is where my encyclopedia began, in fact. So let's go to genius and see what I said about that. So I've got quotations from Dryden's poetry on genius, from Samuel Johnson's essays on the life of Pope. He has a great definition of genius here as the power which constitutes a poet, that quality without which judgment is cold and knowledge is inert, that energy which collects, combines, amplifies, and animates. I also have a definition by Sir Joshua Reynolds from his discourses, and Matthew Arnold, the Victorian critic, in his Function of Criticism, also has a great definition of genius. Some other quotations here throughout that I find fascinating. There's another section worth noting. I think style was actually really helpful because I return to this quite a bit. Lectures on style I've read, and what I liked I copied out here. You'll see that I've got quotations from Aristotle, Jonathan Swift, Henry Taylor, James Boswell, a lot from the 18th century, Arthur Quiller Couch from his Art of Writing, and of course Strunk and White, W.K. Wimsatt, Leo Damrosch, some of his observations on Johnson's style, and an excerpt from Hugh Blair's lectures on rhetoric and Belles-Lettres, with a great quotation on the style periodic. So you can see how whatever you're studying as a self-learner, you can use this system to really help remember and to categorize what you want to remember. Literature is really a record of one massive conversation about different aspects of human experience that's taken place over centuries. And you need to understand not just what authors are saying, but also what authors are responding to and saying about each other. So that was my topical section of the encyclopedia. Now let me show you the author section. I have a section of the encyclopedia that's organized by authors. Let me show you what that looks like. So you'll see here that I have a longer abbreviations list. I actually enjoyed using the Encyclopedia of Persons better than the Topical Encyclopedia, and you might find for whatever you're studying, one or both of those will work. But let's see how this works. This I did not organize alphabetically. I actually organized this chronologically. So it begins with Gorgias of Leontini, and when I was studying a bit about him, I was reading, and anytime I came to an interesting fact about him or his life or his works, I cataloged it here. So if it's just about Leontini, I added it here without a heading. If it's about a specific work, I've added the heading. So this is from his work Encomium of Helen, which is a great rhetorical exercise. And then I moved on to Plato and several others. Who else is interesting here? Arthur Golding, who was the translator of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Shakespeare read his edition. I have information about his life from my reading that I've copied out, and about his works. Here's a list of his works. Ovidius is really the point of interest here with any English literature person studying the Elizabethan period. I also have some interesting quotations from his preface of the Metamorphoses, which introduces kind of an anthropology and a theory of myth. So that's something that's interesting. Another figure that I really enjoyed reading was Jeremy Taylor, who is a Caroline divine. He was a preacher during Charles II's reign and after, during the Puritan interregnum. And I have some comments by critics, and I also have some excerpts from his works. His Holy Living and Holy Dying is a great work of devotional literature, and it has been for many, many years, and it's another one of those 17th century works that the Romantics brought back with their interest, especially the early Romantics like Southey, Lamb, and Coleridge. So I wanted to understand a little bit more about him and actually enjoyed him, found a companion in some of his works. And then, for instance, we have John Dryden here. Now I'm only showing you a little bit. You can see this is 69 pages long, 10-point font, Garamond, double columned, so it gets quite lengthy. Information about Dryden's biography. Loved this, how as a young reader, Dryden actually didn't like Spenser and thought that Sylvester's Du Bartas was better. And of course, as his tastes mature, he realized that Du Bartas is not really great, especially compared to the Fairy Queen. He has comments on style, so you'll see I'll organize some of his excerpts here for these great big authors like Dryden. His comments on the English language, which is actually from a work of criticism from Tillotston's book on Pope. Comments from Walter Jackson Bate, along with Tillotson and several others. Comments about his specific works, Religio Laici, and several others. So the major principle of this, and you can do it however you want, is that any bit of information you put into your brain has to be connected with something that's already there. So if you want to think of George Herbert, or if you're reading a biography of George Herbert, you need to think of him within this whole network of other literary writers and events and political events and circumstances that are all shaping his life and his works to some extent. This method works for learning a literature, learning dates in history, and for learning really any kind of discipline. And depending on the discipline, it's going to change. You ought to customize this to your own purposes. This is how you remember everything that you've read. So begin with annotations, make an index in the back of your book, note topics and dates, and then have somewhere where you can log that afterward, because just the act of copying out those quotations actually helps ingrain that into your mind. Compile this reading encyclopedia as a way to actually go back to what you've read and find what you've read. You can't do that in a handwritten commonplace book, although there are great benefits to handwriting the quotations. Reread all of this at the end of the year. I will sometimes print this out, have this printed out into a spiral bound, and we'll read it at the end of the year, just to make a refresher of what I've learned and what I've read in years past. It doesn't make for sensational reading on the train, but it does keep the paths of memory fresh. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found a new way to log your notes, and of course to customize in your own way. Thanks for watching, and until next time.